The moment I heard my future mother-in-law's voice whispering about taking my home, draining my savings, and making sure I would never be believed, something inside me went cold and sharp. I didn't gasp. I didn't move. I smiled silently at my reflection in the mirror, because in that instant I understood two terrifying truths at once. They thought I was alone and powerless, and I had just learned their entire plan. Before I tell you the complete story, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from, so this story reaches the people who need it most. 3 days before my wedding, I was standing barefoot in a department store fitting room, adjusting the pleat of my ivory satin dress and trying to decide on shoes. I had already tried on 6 pairs. The 7th pair, simple, elegant heels, felt almost right, but something deep inside me hesitated. I'd learned long ago to trust that feeling. Growing up in foster care teaches you that instinct is sometimes the only thing that keeps you safe. By 25, I had built a life entirely on my own. A 1-bedroom apartment provided through a state housing program. A stable job as a project coordinator at an infrastructure firm. No family safety net, but also no one controlling me. I paid my bills, planned my future, and relied on no one. Marriage was never part of my original plan, until Daniel Cross stepped into my life like a perfectly written promise. I met Daniel 6 months earlier at a corporate holiday reception. He was tall, well-dressed, confident without being arrogant. He listened when I spoke, remembered small details, sent flowers every week without fail, took me to quiet restaurants where he insisted on sitting across from me, never distracted by his phone. When he held my hand, it felt intentional, as if he was anchoring himself to me. After 1 month, he introduced me to his mother, Lorraine Cross. 2 months later, he proposed during a beach trip to Clearwater, kneeling in the sand as the sun dipped low. I said yes without hesitation, believing I had finally found the family I never had. Lorraine was warm at first. A woman in her mid-50s with perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup, and a calm, professional demeanor. She worked as a nurse at a county clinic and lived with Daniel in a large house in a quiet suburb outside Brookhaven. When Daniel suggested we move in after the wedding, she seemed delighted. "The house is huge," he'd said casually over dinner, "and we can rent out your apartment. It'll be extra income." I agreed without suspicion. The idea of family dinners and shared holidays filled a hole I'd carried since childhood. I didn't notice how Lorraine's gaze lingered when Daniel mentioned my apartment. I didn't question why she asked so many detailed questions about my finances. I told myself I was finally safe. Now, standing in that fitting room, I slipped the shoes off and hung the dress back on the hook. That's when I heard voices drifting through the thin wall of the neighboring stall. At first, I ignored them until I recognized her voice. "Are you sure she suspects nothing?" Lorraine asked quietly. My breath caught. A man replied, his voice smooth and confident. "She won't. The documents are already prepared." My fingers trembled as I unlocked my phone and started recording. "And Daniel," Lorraine continued, "he knows exactly what to do." "He's been coached," the man said. "After the wedding, he'll start slipping the medication into her food. Slowly, she'll think it's stress, hallucinations, confusion. Then we step in." The room spun. "We just need her apartment and her savings," Lorraine added. "After that, she won't be a problem." My knees nearly buckled. They were talking about me. "She has no family," the man said calmly. "No one to question the diagnosis." I pressed my hand to my mouth, forcing myself not to make a sound. My heart thundered so loudly I was sure they could hear it. "And the hospital?" Lorraine asked. "I'll handle that," he replied. "Like the others." "Like the others." The words burned into my mind as footsteps approached. I stopped the recording just as the neighboring door opened. I stayed frozen until I was alone again. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I dressed slowly, deliberately. When I stepped out of the fitting room, my face was calm. my smile steady. Inside, everything had changed. All at once, moments from the past 6 months rearranged themselves into something horrifyingly clear. Daniel's rushed proposal, his interest in my apartment paperwork, his relief when he learned I had no living relatives, the way Lorraine always insisted on handling important matters herself. Outside the mall, the afternoon sun felt unreal. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, replaying the recording over and over until the shock settled into certainty. They were not guessing. They were planning. That evening, Daniel came home smiling, carrying takeout and asking about my shoe search. I kissed his cheek and told him I hadn't decided yet. He wrapped his arms around me and whispered how excited he was to finally be a husband. I smiled back and thought about how easily monsters were human faces. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I didn't have the luxury of panic. I had 48 hours before the wedding. 48 hours to make sure I didn't disappear into a locked ward while they sold my life piece by piece. Running would be easy. Survival would not. If I fled, they'd vanish. And whoever came after me wouldn't be as lucky. So I made a decision that changed everything. I wasn't going to cancel the wedding. I was going to walk straight into it, fully aware, fully prepared, and make sure it ended very differently than they planned. By morning, the fear had settled into something colder and more controlled. I lay beside Daniel listening to his breathing, memorizing the rise and fall of his chest, and wondered how many nights he had slept this peacefully, knowing what he planned to do to me. When he finally stirred and smiled at me like a devoted fiancé, I smiled back just as convincingly. Survival required performance. As soon as he left for work, I locked the door and sat on the kitchen floor, phone in my hand, replaying the recording again. Every word was clear, every voice unmistakable. I copied the file to 3 different cloud accounts and emailed it to myself under an encrypted address. If anything happened to me, that recording had to survive. I needed proof. Real proof. Something that wouldn't disappear if they tried to gaslight me or twist the story. I opened my laptop and started digging. Daniel Cross was an ordinary name. Too ordinary. The first search brought up dozens of profiles, none of them useful. I refined it: city, profession, age. His social media looked spotless. Photos with co-workers, gym selfies, smiling group shots from weddings and parties, including 2 where he stood beside women I'd never met. I clicked one photo and froze. The caption read, "Congrats to Daniel and Emily." Emily. My stomach clenched. I scrolled further back. Another woman. Different hair. Different smile. Same arm around her waist. The caption stopped abruptly about 4 years ago. I searched public records next. Marriage licenses weren't hard to find. It took 15 minutes to confirm what my instincts already knew. Daniel had been married twice before. Both marriages lasted less than a year. Both ended under identical circumstances. Mental incapacity of the spouse. My hands began to shake. I pulled the records for involuntary psychiatric commitments. They weren't public, but fragments existed: court summaries, guardianship transfers, sealed medical rulings. In both cases, Daniel had been granted temporary power of attorney. In both cases, property ownership changed hands shortly afterward. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. This wasn't coincidence. This was pattern. The man Lorraine had spoken to, the calm voice behind the plan, had said, like the others. There were others. I forced myself to breathe and continued. The psychiatrist. I searched the county hospital website until I found him. Dr. Leonard Hale, Chief of Psychiatry. 25 years of experience. Awards. Publications. Community recognition. And 2 former patients whose lives vanished the moment he signed a diagnosis. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms to my eyes. If I confronted Daniel now, I would be dead socially at best and locked away at worst. If I ran to the police without airtight evidence, I would look hysterical, a perfect setup for the story they planned to tell. I needed someone who understood how predators like this operated. By noon, I had found a private investigation firm that specialized in family fraud and institutional abuse. I called from my car parked 2 blocks away, keeping my voice steady. "I need help," I said. "Immediately." We met that afternoon in a quiet office above a bookstore. Julian Reed was nothing like I expected. No trench coat, no dramatic questions. Just a calm, observant man in his 40s who listened without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't look shocked. "This scheme has been around longer than most people think," he said. "What's rare is catching it before the wedding." I slid my phone across the desk and played the recording. Julian listened carefully, then nodded. "That's your leverage, but we'll need more." He ran background checks while I sat there, hands clasped tightly together. When his screen refreshed, he exhaled slowly. "Your fiancé has 2 former wives," he said, "both currently institutionalized, both diagnosed with severe psychiatric disorders within months of marriage, both attended by the same psychiatrist." My throat tightened. "Are they alive?" "Yes," Julian said. "For now." The words chilled me more than if he'd said no. "They were medicated heavily," he continued. "Long-term psychotropic regimens. Enough to keep symptoms active even if the diagnosis was false." I felt sick. "So what do we do?" I asked. He studied me for a long moment. "We expose them, but timing is everything." He explained the risks plainly. If we moved too early, evidence would vanish. Documents destroyed. Connections activated. If we waited too long, I could become the next patient. "What if I don't cancel the wedding?" I asked quietly. Julian's eyes sharpened. "Then they'll think they've won." "That's what I want," I said. "I want them comfortable." The plan took shape quickly. Daniel and Lorraine had invited me to stay at their house the night before the wedding. Julian would need access while they were distracted. We'd need documents, medication samples, financial records, anything tying them to the psychiatrist. "And I need time," Julian added. "Time to coordinate with authorities who won't tip them off." I nodded. "You'll have it." That evening, Daniel came home humming, carrying flowers and asking if I was nervous. I told him I was excited. He kissed my forehead and talked about the honeymoon. I wondered if he'd said the same words to Emily. I barely slept. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified. Every shadow looked like a threat. When morning came, I dressed carefully, applied makeup, and played the part of the glowing bride-to-be. Lorraine greeted me at her house with open arms and syrupy affection. 3 days, she said brightly. "You must be so excited to finally be family." I smiled and hugged her, fighting the urge to recoil. That afternoon, I casually suggested that Daniel take his mother to finalize the catering and cake order while I handled my hair trial in the city. Lorraine agreed instantly, pleased to be useful. They left just after noon. Julian entered the house 15 minutes later. I sat in a salon chair pretending to admire curls while my phone vibrated with updates. "Found files," Julian texted. "Extensive." Then medication logs. Then financial transfers. My pulse raced. An hour later he called. "They kept everything," he said. "Schedules, dosages, notes on behavior changes. They documented their crimes like project plans." I closed my eyes, relief and rage mixing together. "And there's more," he added. "There's a file with your name on it." My breath caught. "They were ready," he said quietly. "Very ready." When I arrived home that evening, Daniel was cheerful, almost euphoric. Lorraine had prepared dinner. They laughed and talked about the ceremony, about family photos, about the future. I watched them closely, noting every glance, every moment of rehearsed normalcy. That night, alone in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and understood the truth fully. They didn't see me as a person. I was a transaction. And tomorrow, they would walk into a ceremony believing the deal was done. I let myself smile in the darkness. They had no idea what was waiting for them. By the time morning came, fear had been replaced by something far more dangerous: focus. I woke before Daniel, lay still and listened to the house breathe. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes clicked softly. Somewhere down the hall, Lorraine's door creaked as she moved about, already preparing for the day like a woman certain everything was unfolding exactly as planned. I slipped out of bed quietly and locked myself in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. In the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. My eyes were sharper, my jaw set with purpose. I reminded myself that nothing could slip. Not a look, not a tone, not a hesitation. If they sensed even a hint of suspicion, they would pivot, destroy evidence, and possibly accelerate their plan. I dressed carefully and stepped into the kitchen where Daniel was pouring coffee. He smiled warmly, the same smile that had once made my chest flutter. "Morning, beautiful," he said, handing me a mug. I accepted it without hesitation, though my mind screamed at me not to drink anything he gave me. I pretended to take a sip, letting the steam warm my face while my heart pounded. "You're quiet today," he observed casually. "Just nervous," I replied softly. "I keep thinking about everything that still needs to be done." He chuckled. "That's why you have me. I'll take care of everything." The words nearly made me laugh. Lorraine entered the kitchen moments later, impeccably dressed, her expression bright and maternal. "Good morning, sweetheart. I barely slept thinking about tomorrow." "I know," I said. "It still doesn't feel real." She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her grip lingered just a second too long. "Family changes everything," she said meaningfully. If only she knew how right she was. After breakfast, Daniel announced he had errands to run with his mother. I nodded, pretending to be relieved by the quiet time. As soon as their car pulled out of the driveway, I locked the door behind them and exhaled for the first time that morning. My phone buzzed almost immediately. "Julian, I need to see you," his text read. "Now." We met at a small cafe near the courthouse, tucked away from the street. Julian arrived with a thick folder under his arm and a look I couldn't read. "They're worse than we thought," he said as soon as we sat down. He opened the folder and slid it toward me. Inside were printed copies of everything he'd found in the house. Medication schedules, labeled with dates and dosage increases. Notes tracking behavioral changes. Financial spreadsheets detailing property transfers, shell accounts, and cash withdrawals. And then there were the personal notes. Subject shows resistance. One entry read, "Increased dosage. Reinforce narrative of instability." I felt bile rise in my throat. They were documenting human beings like lab experiments. Julian said quietly, "Your fiancé isn't just complicit. He's methodical." I turned the page and froze. There was my name, a photo of me taken without my knowledge, walking out of my office building. Notes beneath it listed my work schedule, income, property details, and a chilling final line. "No immediate family. Low external risk." "They'd already planned your timeline," Julian continued. "Honeymoon location. Estimated onset of symptoms. Target hospitalization date." I stared at the page until the words blurred. "How do we stop this?" I asked. "We don't stop it," he said. "We finish it. On your terms." Julian explained that he'd contacted a small group within law enforcement who specialized in institutional corruption. They were cautious. Cases like this collapsed easily without airtight evidence. But with the documents, recordings, and corroborating victims, they were willing to act. "On one condition," Julian added, "the confrontation has to be public." I understood immediately. "If we expose them in private," I said, "they'll spin a story." He nodded. "But if witnesses see and hear everything, they lose control of the narrative." That afternoon passed in a blur. I returned to the house, smiling and chatting like a bride-to-be, while my mind ran through every detail of the plan. Timing, placement, my words. Lorraine hovered around me constantly, offering tea, snacks, gentle reassurances. I refused everything politely, claiming nerves. Daniel watched me closely, his eyes flicking to his mother whenever I spoke too much. They were alert. That night, I lay awake again, listening to the sounds of the house. At some point, I heard Lorraine's door open. Soft footsteps crossed the hall. I held my breath as she paused outside my room. After a moment, she moved on. The next morning, the wedding day, arrived wrapped in sunlight and false celebration. I dressed slowly, carefully, stepping into the gown that now felt like armor rather than fantasy. Daniel knocked on my door. Ready. I looked at myself one last time and nodded. At City Hall, the room buzzed with quiet excitement. Guests smiled. Cameras flashed. Lorraine dabbed her eyes dramatically. Daniel squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. The clerk began the ceremony, her voice echoing softly through the hall. Words about love and unity washed over me like static. I barely heard them. Then came the question, do you take Daniel Cross to be your lawful, wedded husband? I inhaled. No. The word cut through the room like glass. Gasps followed. Daniel's grip tightened painfully around my hand. What? He hissed. What are you doing? I stepped back, freeing myself. I'm telling the truth, I said calmly. Lorraine stood abruptly. This is nerves, she insisted. She's overwhelmed. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I overheard a conversation 3 days ago, I said, my voice steady. One about taking my home, my money, and making sure I'd never be believed. I pressed play. Lorraine's voice filled the room. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Daniel lunged toward me, his face contorting. That's fake. Julian stepped forward from the back of the room, holding the folder high. Then explain this, he said, laying the documents on the clerk's table. Medication plans, financial transfers, files on former wives. Lorraine's face drained of color. Before Daniel could speak again, uniformed officers entered the room. Daniel Cross, one announced. Lorraine Cross, Dr. Leonard Hale, you are being detained pending investigation. Dr. Hale was escorted in moments later, his composure shattered, eyes darting wildly. The room erupted into whispers and shocked murmurs as handcuffs clicked into place. Daniel looked at me then, not with love, not even with anger, but with disbelief. You ruined everything, he whispered. No, I replied quietly. You never had anything to begin with. As they were led away, the weight on my chest finally lifted. I stood alone in the center of the room, my dress heavy, my hands shaking, but my mind clear for the first time in days. The nightmare hadn't ended, but it had been exposed. And for the women who came before me, and the life I almost lost, that was only the beginning. The silence that followed their arrest felt unreal, like the room itself was holding its breath. Guests stood frozen, unsure whether to whisper, stare, or pretend none of it had happened. The clerk looked as though she might faint. Someone's phone clattered to the floor, forgotten. I was still standing at the center of the hall in my wedding dress, the fabric suddenly too heavy, as if it carried every lie I had nearly stepped into. An officer gently asked me to sit down. I nodded and moved to a chair near the wall, my legs trembling now that the danger had surfaced. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to ebb, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. Julian stayed close, a quiet, steady presence, while officers escorted Daniel, Lorraine, and Dr. Hale through a side door. Daniel tried to look back once more, but an officer guided his head forward. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see that I was still standing. Within minutes, City Hall was flooded with law enforcement. Statements were taken, names recorded. Guests were dismissed one by one, many of them shaking their heads in disbelief. A few avoided my eyes, as if they felt complicit just for having witnessed the spectacle. Others squeezed my hand, whispering words like brave and unbelievable. None of it felt real yet. When it was finally over, I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt sharper, cleaner, like I had surfaced after being underwater for too long. My phone buzzed relentlessly in my hand. Missed calls, messages from unknown numbers, notifications piling up faster than I could process. News traveled fast, and something told me this story would not stay contained within those walls. Julian drove me home. Neither of us spoke much on the way. My thoughts were racing ahead, already wondering what came next. Exposure was only the first step. I knew that from the moment I chose not to run. Somewhere in a locked ward, women were living the future I had narrowly escaped. That evening, after changing out of the dress and folding it away like an artifact from another life, I sat on the edge of my bed and finally let myself cry. Not loud, not dramatically, just quiet tears slipping down my face as the weight of it all settled in. I cried for myself, for the trust one had given so freely, and I cried for the women whose names I still barely knew. The next morning, Julian called early. His voice was calm, but there was urgency beneath it. "They're talking," he said. "Not all of them, but enough." I met him at his office an hour later. The place buzzed with activity. Phones ringing. Papers spread across desks. It felt less like a private investigation firm and more like the nerve center of something much bigger. "They didn't start here," Julian explained, spreading files out in front of me. "This has been going on for years. Multiple cities, different victims, same pattern." He showed me photographs of women I had never met. Different faces, different ages, but the same vacant look in their eyes. Mugshots taken during psychiatric intake. Hospital records. Guardianship transfers. Property sales finalized within weeks of commitment. They targeted women who owned property and lacked strong family ties, he continued. Once the diagnosis was in place, everything else followed. My stomach churned as I recognized the efficiency of it. It wasn't chaotic or impulsive. It was structured, rehearsed, perfected over time. And the women? I asked quietly, "Where are they now?" Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second. 2 are still alive. 1 here in the county facility, 1 in a neighboring state. The others, he didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need him to. By the afternoon, detectives formally interviewed me. I told them everything from the fitting room to the ceremony, careful to recount every detail exactly as it happened. They listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances that confirmed my worst fears. This was not a one-off crime. It was an operation. A detective slid a folder toward me. "These are the names of the women we've identified so far," he said gently. "We believe there may be more." I scanned the list, my chest tightening with every unfamiliar name. Lives reduced to case files. "Can I see them?" I asked. He frowned slightly. "They're in fragile condition." "I know," I replied, "but they deserve to know someone fought back." After some discussion, arrangements were made. The psychiatric facility was a stark, imposing building set back from the road, surrounded by high fencing and manicured lawns that did nothing to soften the sense of confinement. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something heavier. Resignation, maybe. A new department head, recently appointed after Dr. Hale's arrest, escorted us down a long corridor. "Their treatment plans are being reassessed," he explained. "We've already begun tapering the medications." The first woman we met sat on her bed, hands folded in her lap. She looked younger than I expected. Her hair cut short, her eyes wary but alert. When she looked up at me, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe. Or hope. "You're the one," she said quietly. "The wedding." I nodded, unsure what to say. "They told me I was sick," she continued. "That I imagined things. That my husband was trying to help me." My throat tightened. "You weren't sick," I said firmly. "They lied to you." She stared at me for a long moment, then began to cry. Not hysterically, but with a deep, exhausted grief that seemed to come from years of being unheard. I sat beside her and let her hold my hand. The The second woman was in worse condition. She barely spoke, her gaze unfocused, her movements slow. But when I told her my name and explained why I was there, her fingers curled weakly around mine. It was enough. Leaving the facility, I felt both shattered and determined. What had been done to them could never be fully undone, but it could be acknowledged, corrected, stopped. The days that followed were relentless. Statements, meetings, calls with attorneys, media requests I declined. I learned that Daniel and Lorraine had already begun negotiating, trading information for leniency. Dr. Hale, faced with overwhelming evidence, had started naming accomplices, bank employees, notaries, officials who had looked the other way. The scale of it was staggering. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment surrounded by paperwork, it hit me how close I had come to losing all of this. My home, my freedom, my sense of self. The thought sent a shiver through me. I stood and walked through each room, slowly, grounding myself in the reality of it. This space was mine. My life was mine. And I wasn't finished yet. Somewhere deep inside, a new resolve took shape. Exposing them hadn't been the end of my role. It had only been the beginning. The days blurred together after that, measured not by hours, but by revelations. Each morning brought another phone call, another document, another name added to the growing list of people who had played a role, actively or passively, in destroying lives. I learned quickly that monsters rarely work alone. They thrive in systems that reward silence and convenience. Julian and I met almost daily. His office became my second home, its walls slowly disappearing behind pinned timelines, photographs, and color-coded notes. Red for victims, blue for accomplices, yellow for financial trails. What had once been a neat, contained crime expanded outward like ink and water. Daniel talked first. It didn't surprise me. Of the three, he had always been the weakest link. Lorraine believed in what she was doing with chilling conviction. Dr. Hale hid behind professional language and legal nuance. Daniel, however, cracked under the weight of exposure. He confessed to 2 prior marriages in detail, outlining how each relationship had been engineered from the start. Chance meetings, accelerated courtship, emotional dependence, marriage, medication, diagnosis, guardianship, property transfer, divorce, over and over again. He said he felt trapped. Julian told me after one interrogation. Claims his mother pushed him into it. I felt no sympathy. Feeling trapped didn't excuse becoming a predator. Daniel also confirmed something that made my stomach turn. Lorraine had been the scout. She noticed vulnerable women at the clinic, women who owned property and lacked close family. She watched, listened, gathered details. Then Daniel made the introduction. As for Dr. Hale, he provided legitimacy. White coats, medical jargon, authority that no one questioned. People hear psychiatrist and stop asking questions, Julian said grimly. The women they targeted didn't stop resisting because they were weak. They stopped because the entire world told them they were broken. That truth sat heavy in my chest. One afternoon, I received permission to speak again with the first woman I'd met at the facility. Her name was Clara. She was stronger now, her eyes clearer, though exhaustion still lined her face. "They're changing my medication," she told me softly. "The new doctor says I was over-medicated for years. Do you remember when it started?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "After my wedding. I told my husband I felt dizzy. He said it was anxiety. Then the pills came." My fingers curled into my palm. "They took my apartment while I was inside," she continued. I kept asking why no one believed me. I swallowed hard. "We're working on getting it back." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't even care about the apartment anymore," she whispered. "I just want my name back." That sentence haunted me. Legal proceedings began quickly, but justice moved at its own pace, slow, methodical, often infuriating. Guardianship orders were challenged. Diagnoses were reviewed by independent specialists. Financial transactions were frozen pending investigation. Some buyers protested, claiming ignorance. Others quietly returned properties, eager to avoid scrutiny. The truth had a way of making people cooperative. I testified twice that week. Each time, recounting the fitting room conversation felt surreal, as if it had happened to someone else. But every retelling strengthened the case. My recording became a cornerstone, undeniable, damning, impossible to explain away. Media interest intensified. My name circulated online, paired with words like brave and lucky. I avoided interviews. This wasn't about attention. It was about accountability. One night, alone in my apartment, I found myself staring at the ring Daniel had given me. It sat forgotten in a drawer, a symbol of how easily trust could be weaponized. I considered throwing it away, then stopped. Instead, I placed it in a small box along with copies of the evidence Julian had given me. Proof of how close I'd come to losing everything. Not as a reminder of fear, but of clarity. The following week, I met with an attorney specializing in victims' rights. She listened carefully, her expression unreadable until I finished. "You understand," she said slowly, "that once you step fully into this, there's no going back." I nodded. I already crossed that line. She leaned forward. "Good, because people like this rely on victims disappearing. You didn't." Together, we began preparing civil suits, not just against Daniel, Lorraine, and Dr. Hale, but against institutions that had enabled them through negligence. Clinics that failed to question patterns, banks that ignored suspicious transfers, offices that processed paperwork without scrutiny. Each filing felt like reclaiming a piece of stolen ground. Emotionally, the toll caught up with me in unexpected ways. Loud noises made me jump. I checked locks repeatedly. Sometimes I woke, convinced someone was standing over my bed. Julian noticed. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said gently one evening after I flinched at a sudden knock. "I know," I replied. "I just don't know how to set it down yet." He didn't push. He simply stayed. Slowly, moments of quiet returned. Mornings where I drank coffee without scanning the room. Walks where I noticed the sky instead of exits. Small victories, but real ones. The biggest change, though, was internal. I no longer questioned my instincts. That hesitation in the fitting room, the pause I almost ignored, had saved my life. I promised myself I would never silence that voice again. When I visited Clara a third time, she looked different. Stronger. More present. "They say I can leave in a few weeks," she said, a hint of disbelief in her tone. I smiled. "That's incredible." She reached for my hand. "You know, if you hadn't overheard them." "I did," I said gently. "And now we make sure it never happens again." As I left the facility that day, the weight I'd been carrying shifted slightly, not lighter but better balanced. I understood now that survival wasn't just about escaping harm. It was about choosing what you did with the truth once you had it. And I wasn't finished choosing yet. The investigation reached a point where the truth could no longer be contained within offices and courtrooms. It spilled outward into public view, and with that came consequences I hadn't fully prepared for. Reporters waited outside buildings. Commentators speculated about motives and morality. People I had never met formed opinions about who I was and what I should feel. I learned quickly that once a story becomes public, control is an illusion. Julian warned me early. "They'll try to shift the focus," he said, "from what they did to who you are." He was right. Some articles framed me as fortunate, a woman who narrowly escaped a nightmare. Others painted me as reckless for not backing out sooner, as if courage could be scheduled neatly without fear. A few questioned my intentions altogether. I stopped reading after the first week. I didn't need strangers narrating my trauma. What mattered was what was happening quietly, steadily behind the scenes. The legal work intensified. Subpoenas were issued. Financial institutions, froze accounts linked to Daniel and Lorraine. Dr. Hale's medical license was suspended pending trial. Former colleagues came forward with stories they had once brushed aside, patients who didn't quite fit their diagnoses, families who had raised concerns only to be reassured by authority. Patterns emerged with alarming clarity. Julian uncovered evidence that the group had refined their approach over time. Early cases were sloppy. Victims questioned inconsistencies that led to adjustments, stronger isolation tactics, heavier medication, faster property transfers. Efficiency replaced improvisation. It was chilling to see cruelty evolve. I spent long hours with attorneys, going through timelines and preparing statements. Sometimes during breaks, I found myself staring out of windows, grounding myself in the simple reality of sunlight and passing cars. Life continued outside this nightmare, indifferent and steady. One afternoon, Julian handed me a folder marked with a single name. Emily Hart, he said. My heart skipped. Daniel's first wife, he continued. She's still alive. The room seemed to tilt. Where is she? I asked. Transferred to a long-term facility 2 states over. No visitors for years. I didn't hesitate. I want to see her. Arranging the visit took time. By then, Emily's case had been flagged for review, and an independent psychiatrist had begun reassessing her diagnosis. The initial reports suggested what we already knew: prolonged chemical suppression, not illness. When I finally met her, she was thinner than the photographs, her hair streaked with gray far too early. She sat across from me in a quiet room, studying my face with cautious curiosity. You're the bride, she said softly. I was supposed to be, I replied. She nodded, a sad understanding passing between us. He told me I was fragile, Emily said, that he'd take care of everything. When I started asking questions, the pills started. My chest tightened. You weren't fragile. She smiled faintly. I know that now. That moment changed something in me, seeing the long-term cost of what they'd done. The years stolen, the identity eroded, turned my resolve into something immovable. From that day on, I stopped seeing myself as someone who had escaped. I was someone who had been spared long enough to act. The trials began months later. Courtrooms filled with lawyers, evidence, and quiet spectators. Daniel testified against his mother, and Dr. Hale in exchange for leniency. Watching him speak felt surreal. His voice shook as he described actions he once carried out with calculated calm. Lorraine remained defiant. She insisted she had acted out of love, out of necessity, that she was protecting her son's future. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Dr. Hale's defense leaned heavily on technicalities and plausible deniability. But the weight of testimony from former patients, from colleagues, from independent experts, crushed his carefully built facade. When verdicts were delivered, there was no sense of triumph, only a quiet finality. Sentences were handed down, assets seized, licenses revoked. Justice, I learned, was not dramatic. It was deliberate. After the trials, something unexpected happened. Women began reaching out to me. Some shared stories eerily similar to mine. Others described different schemes, different abusers, but the same sense of being unheard. I read every message. I responded when I could. The sheer volume made one thing painfully clear. What I had uncovered was not rare. With Julian's encouragement, I began speaking with advocacy groups. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence. I shared my experience not as a spectacle, but as a warning and a guide. Trust your instincts. Ask questions. Document everything. The idea for a foundation took shape organically. A small organization focused on supporting victims of institutional abuse, legal guidance, investigative support, emotional care. I poured myself into it, channeling the restless energy that once fueled fear into something constructive. It wasn't easy. There were days I felt overwhelmed. Days the weight of other people's pain pressed too heavily on my chest. Therapy helped. So did boundaries. I learned that being strong didn't mean absorbing everything. Throughout it all, Julian remained constant. He never pushed for more than I could give, never assumed I needed saving. He treated me as a partner and equal. One evening, after a long day of meetings, we sat quietly in my living room, exhaustion settling over us both. You know, he said thoughtfully, most people would have walked away after surviving something like this. I shrugged. Walking away wouldn't have let me sleep. He smiled faintly. Fair. As time passed, my life found a new rhythm. Work, advocacy, quiet evenings. The fear that once clung to every moment faded into something manageable, something that reminded me to stay aware without stealing my peace. I still checked locks. I still trusted slowly. But I also laughed again, genuinely and without reservation. One night, months after the final verdict, I stood on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on. The air was warm, carrying the distant hum of life, continuing. I thought about the woman I had been in that fitting room, hesitant, hopeful, unaware. She hadn't known how strong she was yet. I did now, and I knew something else too. What I had done wasn't about punishment or exposure alone. It was about ensuring that silence was no longer an option, for me or for anyone else. There were still battles ahead, still systems to challenge, stories to hear, work to be done. But I no longer felt alone in it. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was mine. And that made all the difference. The months after the trials settled into a strange, unfamiliar quiet. Not peace exactly. More like the calm that follows a storm when debris is still scattered everywhere. But the sky has finally cleared. I moved through my days with a new awareness of time, of how easily it could have been taken from me, and how deliberately I now chose to spend it. The foundation grew faster than I expected. At first, it was just me, Julian, and a volunteer attorney who believed deeply in what we were trying to build. Then came social workers, therapists, paralegals, and investigators who had seen too many cases quietly buried by paperwork and authority. Each person brought their own story, their own reason for showing up. None of us were here by accident. Emails arrived daily from people across the country. Some described near-identical patterns, sudden diagnoses, isolation from friends, partners who seemed loving until they weren't. Others wrote simply to say thank you, that hearing my story had helped them trust the doubt they'd been feeling for months. I answered as many as I could, even when it left me emotionally drained. If I'd learned anything, it was that being believed could change the trajectory of a life. Clara was released from the facility 6 weeks after the final ruling. I was there when she walked out, carrying a single bag of belongings and blinking against the sunlight like someone stepping into a new world. She laughed nervously, unsure what freedom was supposed to feel like. They said I might feel disoriented, she said, but honestly, I just feel light. We helped her find temporary housing, then began the slow legal process of restoring her assets. It was frustrating and bureaucratic, but every signed document felt like a piece of her life being handed back. Emily's recovery was slower. Years of chemical suppression had left scars that therapy and time could not erase overnight. Some days she was sharp and present, angry in a way that felt healthy. Other days she withdrew, overwhelmed by memories that surfaced without warning. I visited when I could, never pushing, just reminding her she wasn't forgotten. You know, she told me once, staring out a window at a tree-lined courtyard, I used to think the worst part was losing my home. Now I think it was losing my sense of reality. I understood that too well. The legal aftermath continued to ripple outward. Institutions named in civil suits scrambled to review policies. Some denied responsibility until faced with undeniable evidence. Others quietly settled, preferring reform over public exposure. I learned quickly that change rarely came from moral awakening. It came from accountability. Still, change came. New oversight measures were implemented. Mandatory second opinions. Cooling off periods for psychiatric commitments tied to financial transfers. Transparency where secrecy had once thrived. None of it brought back lost years, but it closed doors that should never have been open in the first place. Personally, I struggled with identity in ways I hadn't anticipated. For a long time, my life had revolved around survival and exposure. When that urgency faded, I felt unmoored. Who was I when I wasn't reacting to danger? Therapy helped me untangle that question. So did ordinary moments, cooking dinner, taking walks, sitting in silence without scanning for threats. I learned to enjoy simplicity again. Julian and I grew closer, though neither of us rushed to define it. There was comfort in shared understanding, in knowing the other person respected boundaries shaped by trauma. One evening, while sorting through old case files, he paused and looked at me thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "you don't owe anyone anything anymore." I smiled faintly. "I know. I just choose to stay." That choice mattered to me. There were setbacks, of course. A lawsuit delayed. A witness who recanted out of fear. A night when memories surfaced too vividly and sleep wouldn't come. Healing wasn't linear. I accepted that. What surprised me most was how often people asked if I was angry. The truth was more complicated. Anger had burned hot in the beginning, sharp and necessary. It had propelled me forward when fear threatened to paralyze me. But over time it cooled into something steadier, a commitment to awareness, to protection, to refusing silence. I didn't want my life defined by hatred. I wanted it defined by clarity. One afternoon, while reviewing intake forms at the foundation, I came across a familiar pattern again. A woman in her early 30s, recent marriage, sudden psychiatric evaluation, financial irregularities. My chest tightened as I read. This time, though, we intervened early. With legal backing and investigative support, we halted the process before it escalated. The woman was shaken but safe. When she thanked me, her voice trembling with relief, I realized something profound. This was the difference. Catching it before the damage became irreversible. That night, I stood once more on my balcony, the city humming softly below. I thought about the version of myself who had once believed family was something you accepted at any cost. I knew now that real family, real connection, never demanded your silence, your sanity, or your surrender. I wasn't naive anymore, but I wasn't closed off either. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but honest. And for the first time, uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like possibility. The first anniversary of everything passed quietly. No ceremonies, no speeches, just a date circled in my calendar that I chose not to erase. I spent that morning walking along the river, watching the water move forward without hesitation, carrying whatever fell into it and never looking back. I realized then that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering without being pulled under. The foundation had officially opened its second office by then. What began as a response to one crime had grown into a network. Lawyers, therapists, investigators, advocates, people who understood that harm often wore respectable faces. We weren't chasing monsters anymore. We were dismantling systems that allowed them to hide. Clara started working part-time with us, handling intake calls. At first, she doubted herself constantly, apologizing for every small mistake. Then one day I overheard her on the phone, calm and firm, telling the caller, "You're not imagining this. Let's go through it together." When she caught me listening, she blushed. I just smiled. She was finding her voice again. Emily took longer, but progress came in quiet ways. She began painting, abstract at first, dark colors layered thickly on canvas. Over time, lighter shades appeared. She once told me she painted because words still felt unreliable. I understood that too. Julian and I never rushed into declarations. What we built was steady, deliberate. Trust earned slowly, day by day, without performances or promises designed to impress. One evening, as we locked up the office together, he reached for my hand. Not urgently, just there. I let myself lean into that simple certainty. Occasionally, letters arrived from correctional facilities. Apologies, explanations, regret written too late. I read them once, then filed them away. Closure didn't come from their words. It came from watching victims reclaim pieces of their lives. The most meaningful moments were often the smallest. A woman calling to say she'd canceled a suspicious appointment. A judge asking sharper questions than before. A doctor requesting guidance on ethical safeguards. Each one felt like a quiet correction to a system that had failed too many. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I sat alone reviewing case notes when my phone buzzed. A message from a young woman I didn't know. I was engaged, it read. Something felt wrong. I found your story. I walked away today. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I'm proud of you, I typed back. Trust yourself. I locked the office and stepped outside into the cool night air. The city lights reflected in the windows, fragmented but bright. For a moment, I thought about the fitting room where all of this had begun. The voice I'd almost ignored, the pause that had changed everything. I understood now that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it asks you to stop, to listen, to question what everyone else accepts without thought. My life wasn't perfect. It wasn't simple, but it was honest. And it was mine. I walked forward without fear, knowing that even if darkness tried to hide behind familiar faces again, I would recognize it. I would trust myself, and I would never be silent. If my story moved you, do a small favor before you go. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach people who may need them most. Thank you for listening.